The sun was rising over Los Angeles, and the city was humming with that restless Hollywood energy, the kind that makes dreams explode or collapse. And in the middle of all that lived a 60-year-old actress named Eleanor Grace, a woman whose name once ruled every award show stage, every billboard corner, every magazine cover, and people used to say that her eyes alone could carry a whole movie. But time had rolled forward and new faces had taken over the spotlight, and Eleanor had stepped a little back. Not because she was fading, but because she wanted the world to remember her for quality, not noise, and she chose peace over constant competition. But now her peace was about to be disturbed in a way she never expected, because a new movie project had come up, a massive studio-backed production, a modern retelling of a classic American story, and every reporter in town was buzzing about who would lead the cast. And then suddenly Eleanor got the call, her agent screaming with excitement, telling her that the studio wanted to meet and discuss a major role, a role that could mark her return to the center of Hollywood power. And Eleanor smiled because she felt ready, she felt sharp, she felt alive. But the studio had also hired a young producer named Tyler Dana, 32-year-old wunderkind who people in town whispered about as the future king of Hollywood. He was ambitious, charismatic, and always surrounded by people who treated him like a genius, and Tyler had made up his mind that he did not want a 60-year-old star in his modern movie. He wanted a young, fresh roster, so he planned to drag the meeting into a corner, make it look like Eleanor was not a fit, and politely push her out, thinking she would quietly accept it, because older actresses always got pushed out in this town. But Tyler did not know Eleanor, and he did not know that the woman he was underestimating had built entire careers with her presence and saved entire productions with her calm power. And when Eleanor walked into the studio lobby wearing a simple black blazer, minimal makeup, and a quiet, confident aura, everyone stopped talking for a moment, because legends carry their own weather. And Eleanor walked to the meeting room, her steps smooth, steady, assured, while Tyler inside was laughing with assistants, thinking this meeting would be easy. But it was about to become the moment that flipped both their lives in ways neither had seen coming. As Eleanor reached for the door and pushed it open with the serene strength of a woman who knew exactly who she was and exactly what Hollywood still owed her. Eleanor stepped inside the conference room, and the whole place shifted, like the air itself stood up straighter. The assistants who had been whispering about Tyler's big ideas suddenly went silent, because the presence of a real Hollywood icon is never small, no matter how many new faces show up in town. And Tyler, who had been leaning back in his chair with that relaxed, youthful arrogance, quickly straightened, noticing the sudden change in the room, but still convinced he had control. He flashed a smug grin and said they were so honored that she came, as if he were giving her a favor and not asking for the kind of talent that built studios brick by brick. But Eleanor just smiled softly, because she had learned long ago that arrogance has an expiration date, and she took her seat with grace while everyone else scrambled to look organized. Tyler launched into a speech about the movie, how it needed a fresh direction, how the new generation wanted energy, not nostalgia, how the audience had changed. And Eleanor listened quietly, not reacting, not interrupting, and that unsettled him, because he expected her to defend herself or argue back, and he wanted that because it would be easier to shut her down. But instead, she sat there like a mountain, unmoving, unbothered, and completely in control. And when Tyler finished, he leaned back again, sure he had made his point, and thinking she would politely decline the role on her own without him having to push harder. But Eleanor simply asked him to describe the emotional core of the story, and Tyler blinked, because he had not expected her to ask something that serious. He thought she would talk about costumes or trailers or prestige, but she had cut right into the heart of filmmaking, and he stumbled trying to explain the characters, because despite all his swagger, he was not deeply connected to the soul of the story. He was only connected to its potential success, and the room noticed. Even his assistant looked down, trying not to show the awkwardness. Eleanor then spoke with a calm, steady voice, saying that a story without emotional roots was like a house without a foundation, that people do not show up for flash or youth, they show up for truth, for depth, for something real. And suddenly the room felt different, because she was not talking like an outdated actress. She was talking like someone who had lived 6 decades of craft and experience, and the younger team members felt it like a shift in gravity. Tyler tried to regain control, saying that the studio wanted relevance and that older actresses no longer pull audiences, and Eleanor looked right at him, her gaze unwavering, and replied that age is not a limitation, it is a library, and a film that ignores its depth becomes empty and forgettable. And something in Tyler's face twitched, because he did not expect resistance, certainly not from a place of such quiet power. But he still pushed. He said they were considering other actresses, younger ones, influencers even, and the room waited for Eleanor to break or to show insecurity. But she simply smiled again, the kind of smile that comes from decades of surviving every storm this industry could throw. And she told him she had worked with producers who changed entire scripts on a napkin, who rebuilt sets overnight, who fought for art and passion, not trends. And if Tyler wanted to build something that lasted more than a weekend box office, then he needed to understand what legacy meant. The assistants exchanged glances, because the words hit harder than anything Tyler had said, and even though she had spoken softly, the truth in her voice felt like thunder. And for the first time, Tyler felt small in a room he thought he owned, but he still wasn't ready to give up, not yet, because his ego was louder than his logic. Eleanor stood up, shook his hand, and simply said, "I will wait for your final decision," and she walked out, leaving the entire room suspended in a silence thick enough to hold its breath. And Tyler stayed, sitting, his jaw tight, his pride bruised, but still planning to push her out. Without realizing, he had just awakened a storm far bigger than he could control. Tyler sat there long after Eleanor left the room, feeling that strange mix of irritation and fear that only comes when someone exposes a truth you were trying hard not to see. And he hated that feeling, because he had built his entire young career on confidence, on speed, on being the guy who always knew what to do. But Eleanor had walked in and with barely a handful of words shook the ground under him without even trying, and that bruised his ego in a way he had never experienced. So he decided he would double down and make sure the studio picked someone younger, someone he could control, someone without the weight of a legendary career behind her. He started making calls, lining up actresses who were half Eleanor's age and twice as desperate, scheduling back-to-back meetings and rehearsals, trying to fill the role with someone who would fit into his plan like a puzzle piece. And everyone around him acted excited, pretending his choices were brilliant, but deep down some of them remembered the way the room shifted when Eleanor had spoken, and they felt something missing, a spark, a depth, a soul that only comes from someone who has lived and breathed the art for decades. But nobody dared to say it out loud, because Tyler was still the rising star, with titles and headlines praising him as the future of Hollywood. Meanwhile, Eleanor walked out of the studio building into the California sun, breathing steadily, not angry, not shaken, just thoughtful, because she had seen producers like Tyler all her life, young, hungry, brilliant in some ways, but blind in others, and she knew that if he kept following the shallow path, he would crash hard, because Hollywood can make you a king today and bury you tomorrow. And she had survived long enough to witness it again and again. She knew how fast power shifts, how quickly trends die, how easily studios crumble under bad decisions masked as innovation. Eleanor went home to her quiet hilltop house overlooking the city, where she had built a life of strength and stillness, and she sat in her garden sipping tea, feeling the breeze, and thinking about the meeting, replaying Tyler's words and tone, trying to decide whether he was just inexperienced or genuinely dismissive of older women in the industry she had fought for decades. And slowly, she felt a fire begin to rise inside her, not a loud, angry fire, but a slow, steady, unwavering flame, the kind she felt When she faced obstacles early in her career, the kind she had not felt in years, and she realized she was not upset at Tyler, she was challenged, and she was ready for the challenge. Her phone buzzed, her agent calling to ask how the meeting went, and Eleanor simply said it went exactly as it needed to, and that caught her agent off guard because nobody could read Eleanor's tone like he could, and he sensed something shifting in her, something fierce and calm at the same time, and it made him smile because he knew if Eleanor wanted a role, she would not chase it, she would draw it toward her with gravity, not effort. Back at the studio, Tyler pitched his new choices to the executives with flashy presentations and energetic speeches talking about numbers and trends and youth engagement. But the executives were seasoned veterans who had seen countless young producers rise and fall, and they listened politely, but with an uneasy feeling that something was off, and one of them asked if Eleanor had been considered seriously, and Tyler quickly said she was not the right fit, weaving a narrative that made it sound like she lacked relevance and vision, and for a moment it almost worked. But then the oldest executive in the room, a 70-year-old studio legend named Richard Wells, spoke up, reminding everyone that Eleanor had saved 2 failing movies in the past by stepping in at the last minute, delivering performances that critics still reference today. And he asked Tyler if he had even watched her past work, and Tyler lied, saying he had studied everything, but his voice betrayed him just enough that Richard noticed, and that single moment planted doubt in the room. As Tyler walked out thinking he had won the room, a junior assistant rushed after him, handing him a folder that had been dropped earlier, and inside was a handwritten note from the director praising Eleanor's ability to elevate any script into art, and Tyler felt a pinch of frustration because everywhere he turned there were reminders of her power, her reputation, her legacy, a force he had wrongly assumed was easy to dismiss. And while he paced around planning new ways to push her out, Eleanor was preparing for something entirely different. She was preparing not to fight, but to show the industry once again what real star power looked like, and deep inside, she knew that the story was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun, and the city of Hollywood was about to witness a showdown between raw ambition and timeless mastery, the kind of battle that changes careers, shapes narratives, and leaves the town buzzing for decades to come. The next morning, the entire studio lot buzzed with small whispers drifting between coffee carts and lighting trucks, because news travels fast in Hollywood, especially when it involves a legend and a rising young producer, and people were already sensing tension in the air. Although nobody had full details yet, they could feel something shifting like weather before a storm, and Tyler walked through the lot with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won the game, unaware that the game had only just begun, and that he had underestimated the one person you never underestimate in this town, a 60-year-old icon who carried decades of truth, skill, and presence. He barged into a conference room and told his team they would move forward with auditions for younger actresses, and he wanted everything set within 2 days, because he wanted to seal the deal before anyone could question his choices again, and his team nodded, but with heavy hesitation, because deep inside they knew something was off, something hollow about the direction he was forcing, but none of them dared to challenge him, because challenging a powerful young producer in Hollywood was often career suicide, and they all needed their jobs. While Tyler was pushing the wrong pieces into place, Eleanor was meeting with the director of the film, a man named Samuel Hart, a quiet, introspective storyteller who had admired Eleanor since he was a kid, watching her movies late at night on an old television in his parents' living room. And when Eleanor stepped into his office, he stood up instantly, his respect visible in the way his posture softened and his eyes warmed, and he told her he had always envisioned her in the role the moment he finished the script, and hearing that felt like a breath of honesty in a world that often hid truth behind marketing and numbers. Eleanor listened and felt gratitude, but she could also sense conflict in his voice, a struggle that came from being caught between art and studio politics, and she gently asked him if Tyler had pressured him, and Samuel hesitated, then admitted he was being pushed to consider younger actresses even though it did not align with the emotional heartbeat of the film, and Eleanor sat back, absorbing his words with that calm intensity that only someone with years of storms behind them could hold, and she told him that real art often demands courage, the kind that makes people uncomfortable but builds legacies. Samuel looked conflicted because he wanted to stand his ground, but he also knew Tyler had the studio's ear, and one wrong step could cost him the project and perhaps his future opportunities, and Eleanor placed her hand lightly on his desk, not pleading, not asking for favors, simply reminding him that truth has a way of surviving no matter how hard people try to bury it, and Samuel felt something steady inside him strengthen, because her presence carried a weight he had only imagined until now. Meanwhile, Tyler was in the casting room running auditions with forced enthusiasm, trying to convince himself that the younger actresses were perfect even though none of them captured the soul of the character, and every performance felt thin, lacking the depth, the quiet intensity, the lived-in truth the role demanded. But Tyler kept pushing forward, refusing to admit the reality that had begun creeping into his mind, that Eleanor was not just an option, she was the standard, and every actress he brought in only highlighted what she carried effortlessly. As the day went on, word began to spread across social media that Eleanor Grace had walked into the studio earlier, and fans started buzzing about her potential return, and soon entertainment blogs picked it up, posting nostalgic clips of her iconic scenes, writing hopeful headlines about her comeback, and the online attention grew like fire, feeding itself, and fans of all ages began demanding her involvement, tagging the studio, urging them to honor her legacy, and Hollywood being Hollywood. The executives noticed immediately, because fan momentum is powerful currency, and ignoring it can sink a project before it begins. Tyler saw the online trend and felt annoyance tighten in his chest, because the last thing he wanted was public pressure forcing the studio to consider Eleanor again, especially when he had tried so hard to push her out, and his ego raged quietly because he thought he had control, and now the world was reminding him that control in Hollywood is often an illusion shaped by timing, talent, and public love. By evening, the executives called an emergency meeting, demanding updates, questioning the auditions, and asking why the online buzz was favoring Eleanor so heavily, and Tyler stumbled through explanations, painting Eleanor as a risk and a relic, but Richard, the senior executive, watched him with a knowing calm, and then asked him again if he had truly studied her work, because her performances were timeless and audiences still connected to her in ways few actresses ever managed, and Tyler felt cornered, but refused to back down, insisting the film needed youth, not legacy. While the building argued and debated, Eleanor sat at home gazing at old scripts she had kept through the years, remembering moments that shaped her career, remembering battles she fought long before Tyler even existed in the industry, and she felt the same fire rising again, not out of anger, but purpose, because she knew this was not just about a role, it was about the way Hollywood kept trying to erase women once they crossed a certain age, and she was not ready to let that happen without a fight, not a noisy fight, not a desperate fight, but the quiet, unstoppable fight that only queens of the craft know how to deliver. And as the city lights flickered across her windows, Eleanor stood up, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself that she had more to give, more to prove, more to create, and the world would see it soon. And far across town, Tyler stood alone in his office, staring at headlines featuring Eleanor, realizing for the first time that maybe he had misread the game, maybe he had underestimated the storm that comes when a legend decides to rise again. The next day, Hollywood woke with a strange electricity in the air, the kind that happens only when something big is about to break, a story, a movement, a shift, and everyone talking over breakfast tables in diners and offices and backlit trailers felt it like a quiet hum under the surface, because whispers of Eleanor's possible comeback had already spread across every corner of the industry, from casting agencies to newsroom desks, and people could feel something rising, something that had the power to tilt the balance of who holds control in this town. Eleanor woke early and took a slow walk through her garden, the cool morning air brushing through the leaves around her, while she gathered her thoughts steady, calm, centered, because she knew exactly who she was and what she brought to the table, and she refused to let anyone define her worth with numbers or trends that changed every hour. And as she breathed in the morning air, she decided something: she would show Tyler and the entire town what real star power looked like, not by begging or arguing, but by stepping into the light with purpose. By mid-morning, the studio was already in chaos, executives sending emails, calling urgent meetings, because the social media push for Eleanor had exploded overnight. Fans from multiple generations posting clips from her most iconic films, sharing stories of how her characters had shaped their lives, creating hashtags demanding her return, and even news outlets had begun covering the movement, interviewing critics, directors, and old co-stars, who all agreed Eleanor brought something to the screen that could never be replaced, and the studio had no choice but to pay attention, because audience voice is gold in Hollywood. Tyler arrived at the studio seeing all this unfold on his phone, and his stomach tightened because he knew the momentum was slipping out of his hands, and he hated that feeling, hated losing control, hated that one meeting with Eleanor was enough to shake the foundation he thought he owned. And the worst part was the fear creeping in, the fear that maybe he had been wrong, maybe he had ignored the very soul his film needed, and refusing to accept that made him feel cornered, trapped by his own pride and stubbornness. He stormed into the executives' meeting room where Richard and the team were already seated, and he launched into a speech insisting the film needed fresh faces, insisting they needed to stay modern, insisting fans were only reacting to nostalgia. And Richard listened, calmly letting Tyler pour out every argument he had until he finally ran out of breath. And then Richard simply asked him one question: if the younger actresses were so perfect, why had none of their auditions moved him emotionally? And Tyler froze, because he knew the truth, but admitting it would mean accepting defeat. Across town, Eleanor arrived quietly at a small rehearsal studio where Samuel, the director, had invited her for a private reading, unofficial, with no publicity, no pressure, just an artistic test to feel the character. And the moment she stepped inside the space, Samuel felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the same one he felt when great art walked into the room, and he greeted her with respect, offering her the script, and she took it, holding it with reverence and strength, like someone who understood what stories could do to people's hearts. They began reading, not performing, not pushing, just exploring the emotions of the role, and the studio felt as if the air thickened each time Eleanor spoke, because her voice carried layers of history, pain, wisdom, resilience, something no training or youth could replicate. And Samuel found himself drawn deeper into the character with each passing moment, realizing with growing certainty that there was no one else who could play this part, because she was not acting, she was becoming the role in a way he had only dreamed of. Meanwhile, a junior assistant who had always admired Eleanor from afar happened to see her walk into the building earlier, and out of pure excitement posted a small vague message online saying something magical was happening today. And within minutes, fans began piecing things together, and the buzz doubled, then tripled, and soon every entertainment page, every gossip blog, every film discussion thread was alive with speculation that Eleanor was officially returning, and this time the studio could not outrun the wave, even if it tried. By afternoon, the executives demanded proof from Tyler that the younger actresses could carry the film emotionally, and they replayed the audition tapes in a silent room where every performance felt flatter than the last, and Tyler sat there trying to hide the increasing panic building in his chest, because he knew none of them matched what Eleanor could bring, and the executives saw it too, their faces falling one by one as they realized Tyler had led them down a hollow path, one driven by ego, not art, not truth. While they debated what to do, Eleanor finished her reading, and Samuel stood in awe, unable to speak for a moment, because he knew he had just witnessed something sacred, something that only happens once in a long time, and he told her with full honesty that she was the heart of the film, that the character was waiting for her, that without her the story would simply not breathe, and Eleanor felt a warm firmness in her chest, because she had not fought for the role, but the role had found her, and that meant something powerful. As she stepped outside the studio doors, the late afternoon sun washed over her, and the city felt different, almost as if it was bowing, acknowledging her return, and people turned to look, recognizing her instantly, their faces lighting up, their phones rising in excitement. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt what she once felt every day, that hum of admiration, mixed with respect, mixed with destiny, and she knew the tide had shifted. The industry was remembering who she was. Far across town, Tyler sat alone in his office, staring at news headlines that all screamed the same thing: Eleanor Grace is trending again. Eleanor Grace might be back. Eleanor Grace fans flood the studio with support, and he felt something crack within him, not just frustration, not just fear, but the realization that he might be on the wrong side of history, and that the legend he tried to sideline was rising with the kind of force that could reshape the entire narrative of his film, and maybe even his career. And as the sun dipped behind the Hollywood hills, the whole city could feel that the storm was coming, the kind of storm only a true icon can create, and no one knew yet how big the transformation would be, but they all knew one thing: Eleanor Grace was not done, and the young producer who tried to push her aside was about to learn what real star power truly meant. The next morning, the entire industry felt like it was holding its breath, because overnight the buzz around Eleanor had grown into something unstoppable, something electric, something that no studio executive, no producer, no strategist could manufacture. Even if they tried, and every news outlet, every entertainment reporter, every social media platform was filled with her name, her photos, her iconic scenes, her interviews, and the conversation had shifted from speculation to certainty. People were saying she was the only choice, the perfect choice, the necessary choice, and Hollywood listens when the world speaks that loudly. Tyler walked onto the studio lot with an expression that tried to look confident, but could not hide the storm brewing inside him, because he knew today would be the day the executives would demand answers, and he was not ready for the answers they needed, because the truth was becoming undeniable, and it terrified him that the very person he tried to push away was now the force pulling the entire film upward, and he hated that he had been wrong, hated that the narrative was slipping from his hands, and hated that everyone around him could feel it too. Inside the executive boardroom, Richard and the others were already seated, reviewing charts, emails, public sentiment graphs, and projections, and the numbers were overwhelming. Every metric was pointing to Eleanor as the anchor that could carry the film from a simple release to a cultural moment. And when Tyler entered the room, Richard looked at him with a calm expression that held both wisdom and disappointment, and asked him to sit, because they had decisions to make, decisions that would shape the future of the film, and maybe the future of Tyler himself. Richard spoke slowly, with the authority of someone who had survived decades of Hollywood storms, explaining that the film needed strength, authenticity, and emotional gravity, and that Eleanor was not just the best fit, she was the only fit. And Tyler tried to argue again, trying to use words like relevance and modern audience appeal, but this time his voice cracked slightly, because deep down he knew the truth was standing against him, and Richard told him plainly that ignoring someone like Eleanor was not bold, it was foolish. And the room fell silent, because every person present felt the weight of that statement. While this was happening, Eleanor stood in her home, looking at a wall of old movie posters, each one representing a different chapter of her life, and she felt a quiet resolve building inside her, a resolve rooted not in ego, but in purpose, because she knew what this moment meant, not just for her, but for every older actress, every woman who had been told her worth had an expiration date, and she whispered to herself that she was ready to fight this battle, not through conflict, but through excellence, through truth, through the light she had always carried within her. Samuel, the director, arrived at her home shortly after, bringing fresh pages of the script and an energy that felt renewed, strong, clear, because the private reading had changed him too, and he told her he had never seen a character fall into place so naturally, so effortlessly, and that he was willing to stand behind her even if it meant challenging the studio. And she thanked him not with flattery, but with sincerity, because she knew how much courage it took to stand against the weight of politics in this town. Across town, the executives continued debating when suddenly an assistant entered the room, breathless, holding a tablet showing a massive spike in online engagement because a famous late-night host had just mentioned Eleanor on air, praising her work, calling her a legend Hollywood needed now more than ever, and the clip was already going viral, and the executives widened their eyes, because this was not just buzz, this was momentum, and momentum in Hollywood is more powerful than any argument, any presentation, any trend report. Tyler sat there watching it unfold, and something inside him broke open, not anger this time, but fear that he had sabotaged his own project, fear that he had allowed his ego to steer him into a wall, fear that he might lose the respect he had worked so hard to build. And for the first time, he truly questioned himself, questioned whether he had been blind to something everyone else could see so clearly, questioned whether his desire to prove himself had made him betray the very art he claimed to protect. The executives made their decision. They would officially offer the role to Eleanor, and they told Tyler he would need to support the decision publicly and professionally, because his resistance had already raised doubts about his leadership, and if he wanted to remain attached to the film, he would have to show maturity, strength, and respect. And Tyler felt the words hit him like a weight sinking deep into his chest, because he had never been challenged like this, never been held accountable like this. And he realized this was a turning point. Either he adapted or he would fall hard. Meanwhile, Samuel called Eleanor and told her the studio was preparing to make the offer, and Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the news wash over her, but not with surprise, because she had felt the shift coming like a tide returning to shore, and she thanked Samuel for standing with her, for believing in her, for seeing her not as a relic, but as an artist who still had a universe to give. And Samuel assured her that greatness only grows with time, and she was proof of that. As she hung up the phone, Eleanor felt something awaken inside her, a sense of rising, not like climbing a ladder, but like opening her wings again after years of stillness. And she walked to her mirror, not to check her appearance, but to look into her own eyes, the same eyes that had once commanded screens across the world, and she saw the fire there, steady, bright, fearless, and she whispered, "I am not done," and the city seemed to echo it back to her like a promise. By evening, the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the studio lots, the hills, the streets, filled with dreamers and creators, and the industry felt it, the shift, the pull, the change, because legends do not fade. When people try to bury them, they rise stronger, brighter, sharper, and Eleanor Grace was rising now with a force that even time could not diminish, and the young producer who tried to sideline her stood at the edge of the storm, realizing he was about to learn the greatest lesson of his career: what real star power truly is. The studio lot was glowing under the warm California evening lights, as if the entire city was preparing itself for something historic, and everyone working late, from security guards to editors to sound technicians, could feel it, that rare trembling in the air that only comes when a story is about to turn into legend. And the name on every whisper, every message, every headline was the same: Eleanor Grace, the 60-year-old Hollywood icon who had risen again with the kind of force that no youth, no trend, no marketing strategy could compete with, because true greatness does not age, it expands, and tonight it was ready to claim its rightful place. Eleanor arrived at the studio through a private entrance, Samuel walking beside her, carrying the final revised script pages, while her agent kept glancing at his phone as messages from journalists and old colleagues and award voters flooded in, because everyone wanted to know if the rumor was true, if the legend was officially returning, and Eleanor walked with a calm, steady grace, not rushing, not flaunting, just existing in that powerful, quiet way that made people stop and breathe, because her presence was not loud but undeniable. When she entered the conference room, the executives stood up instinctively out of respect, something they had not done for anyone in years, and Richard stepped forward, extending a folder with the official offer contract, and he said the words that shifted the entire course of the film. "We want you to lead this story. We believe this role belongs to you." And the room fell into a soft silence as Eleanor accepted the folder, her hands steady, her gaze strong, because she had not fought for this moment. She had earned it through decades of truth, skill, and soul poured into every performance. Then Tyler entered the room, and for the first time since this battle began, he did not walk like the confident rising star of Hollywood. He walked like someone who had learned a hard lesson, and he paused in front of Eleanor, unsure whether to speak, because he had never apologized in his career, never admitted fault, never faced someone he underestimated so deeply. And Samuel stood beside Eleanor with a protective calm, ready to intervene if needed. But Eleanor simply looked at Tyler, waiting, not judging, not attacking, just waiting for the truth that needed to be spoken. Tyler took a breath, the longest breath of his young career, and said he had been wrong, not just about the role, but about the way he saw the industry, the way he saw women, the way he saw age and experience. And he admitted that he had let his ego shape the entire conflict, and that he had forgotten what storytelling really meant. And Eleanor listened quietly, her expression softening, because she understood the difference between arrogance and growth, and she knew this apology was not polished or rehearsed. It was real, stripped of pride and fear. She told him that talent is not threatened by experience, only by insecurity, and that Hollywood had room for all kinds of brilliance, but only if people stopped trying to erase the wisdom that carries stories from the heart to the screen. And Tyler felt her words hit him deeper than any criticism he had ever heard, because they carried truth without cruelty, strength without hostility. And in that moment he realized why she was who she was, why she was a legend, not because she had survived Hollywood, but because she had elevated it. The contract was signed moments later, cameras flashing through tinted windows as paparazzi began gathering outside, sensing something monumental had happened inside the building, and social media exploded the second the first insider leak hit the internet. Eleanor Grace officially returning to the big screen, fans shouting, crying, celebrating, sharing clips, posting tributes, flooding timelines with love, because people do not forget the artists who shaped their dreams. They wait for them patiently and fiercely. Production began a few weeks later, and the first table read felt like a sacred ceremony, every cast member hanging on to Eleanor's every word, every breath, every subtle shift of emotion, as if learning directly from the universe of acting itself. And Samuel watched her with awe as she brought the character to life, not by performing, but by surrendering to the truth of the script, letting it flow through her with honesty and depth. And even Tyler felt his respect grow with every rehearsal, recognizing that he was witnessing mastery in its purest form. As filming progressed, critics began hearing whispers about the magic happening on set, about scenes so powerful they left crew members in tears, about monologues that hit so deeply they required extra takes, because even the camera team needed moments to breathe. And Hollywood was buzzing louder each day, reporters predicting awards, festivals requesting early screeners, directors stopping by set just to catch a glimpse of Eleanor's transformation, because word of her brilliance was spreading like wildfire again. Months later, the film finally premiered at a prestigious international festival, and the theater was packed with celebrities, journalists, fans, and industry titans, all eager to witness Eleanor's return. And when the lights dimmed, the audience fell silent, the kind of silence that thickens the air, that pulls hearts into a single rhythm. And then the movie began, and the moment Eleanor appeared on screen, the entire theater leaned forward like they were greeting royalty returning to her throne. Her performance was breathtaking, layered, vulnerable, fierce, and deeply human, each scene a masterclass in emotion and truth, and halfway through the film people were already whispering awards, back-to-back awards, and by the time the credits rolled the room erupted into a standing ovation that lasted long enough to become a story of its own, and Eleanor stood there, tears gathering in her eyes, not from pride, but from gratitude, from knowing her art still lived in people's hearts, from knowing she had not just returned, she had risen. Tyler watched from the side of the room, clapping with genuine admiration, because he finally understood the lesson Hollywood had been trying to teach him through this entire storm, that youth may bring fire, but experience brings light, and without light stories cannot shine. And he promised himself that he would carry this lesson forever, letting it shape every project, every decision, every frame he touched. When Eleanor stepped out of the theater, the world outside exploded, cameras flashing, fans cheering, reporters shouting her name. But she walked with the same calm grace. She always carried a gentle smile touching her face as she waved and thanked her supporters, and someone asked her how it felt to be back, and she answered with a voice steady and warm, "I never left, I just waited for the world to remember." And that night, as Hollywood glittered under 1,000 lights, the legend of Eleanor Grace became more than a comeback story. It became a reminder to the entire industry that real star power is not loud or fleeting, it is timeless, rising again and again, no matter who tries to dim it. And her legacy would now shine brighter than ever, because she had not returned to reclaim a crown, she had returned to redefine what a crown truly meant. And the young producer, who once tried to sideline her, walked away with a new understanding etched deep into his soul, that greatness cannot be pushed aside, it can only be honored, learned from, and uplifted. Hollywood would never forget this story. And neither would he. And neither would she. The legend had risen. And the world rose with her.